A shift dress is the perfect combination of easy to make, easy to fit and really comfy to wear. I'm going to show you in this video how to make a pattern from a basic block for this shift dress with the colour blocking, and I'll show you how to put the whole dress together. I'm Ali and I've got a bit of an obsession with shift dresses. I wear them most days and I have a wardrobe full of them. I made my first shift dress when I was still at school, when my mum showed me how to do it as she used to wear them. And that was in 1991. You can imagine I've made quite a few for myself ever since. I love that they are so simple, but a funky fabric just makes it such a gorgeous dress. Let's zoom out now and have a look at the whole dress, front and back. So this is how it looks full length. You can see the width of it now and how long it is, but with this video, you can do this however long, however wide you want it. You can change the fit here. Everything is completely changeable. And just to show the back as well, it's exactly the same as the front. I've kept the stripe same front and back. Again, you can do whatever you want to with that. In this video, I will show you every single thing you need to know. I'm going to start with a fitted bodice block. If you don't already have one, there's a link above and in the description for you to follow to draft one. You'll use it for so many things. It is well worth doing. I will show you how to take that block and then make this pattern from it. Everything I do, you can do your own little adjustments on them. You can have the blocking, whatever proportion you want. You can change the neck shape, you can change the length, the width of the hem. All of these things are changeable. So I'll show you how to do that, how to cut out all of the fabric, how to panel it up, and then how to put the actual dress together, how to bag out the neck, how to finish off the armholes, everything you need to know. So before we get started, you need to just think about a few things for making your pattern. You need to just think about the neck size and the shoulder width and how you want that to fit. With this colour blocking, I like the neck staying high up like this, and I've worked out the width of the banding that I want. I just played around in the mirror with strips of fabric to see what I wanted. But you can do this however you want. You can make your neck wider, you can make it lower. You don't have to have this strip down the front. Everything is changeable with this tutorial. You don't have to make a dress that looks exactly like this if you want to make amendments. So before you get started, think about the neck, think about the shoulder, think about how much ease you might want to add into it and how fitted or unfitted you want it on the waist. And then think about how long you want it and how wide you want the hem of the skirt. So that's everything we need to talk about before we get started. So let's have a look now at how I made the pattern for this dress. I've traced around my fitted bodice block exactly as it is. So because this shift dress isn't a really fitted dress, I'm gonna add some ease before I do anything else. Don't worry about the darts for now. I'm gonna talk about those in a minute. So all I'm gonna do to start with is add some ease from the armhole down to the waist. I've not even thought about the pattern beyond the waist yet. I'm gonna add 3 centimeters extra ease. I've got a little bit of ease in this bodice block anyway, but I want another 3 centimeters in total. So this is obviously half of my pattern, so I need to add in 1.5 centimeters, and I need to divide that between the front and the back. So 7.5 millimeters or 0.75 centimeters is what I'm going to add on to my side seam. Because it's only a small amount, I'm not going to worry about moving these darts, and I'm going to be playing around with the darts in a minute anyway. So this is all I'm going to do for now. So I'm just drawing in my new side seams, and then I'm going to rub out the previous one so it doesn't cause any confusion. And then while redrawing in this little bit where I've accidentally rubbed it out on the armhole, I'm actually just going to lower this by a tiny amount. Literally, it's about 2 or 3 millimeters. I'm just doing that by eye, and I need to do that on both the front and the back. I just don't want my armhole too tight because this isn't a super fitted dress. So that's my side seam and armhole done. I've added my ease in, and now I need to think about how long I want it. So let's just turn this around. So I just need to now draw the full length of my dress. So I've measured this against a dress that I like the length of, and it's going to be 46 centimeters from the waist to the hem. I'm quite short, so chances are yours might be a little bit longer unless you're going for a real mini dress. So I'm just going to draw that in there, and I will do exactly the same on the back. So that's my length now drawn in. That's my front, so you can see all of the bodice now with the ease and the length there. And I now need to put in my hip curve and the width at the bottom. So the hem width I've measured on a dress that I like the fit of, the same one that I've measured the length on, because obviously if you're measuring the width of the hem, it's dependent on how long it is as well, if it's slightly A-line. So this is the total measurement, 146 centimetres. And because I'm having 2 fronts and 2 backs, or 1 front on the fold, which counts as 2, I'm just going to divide that by 4, and that's the width that I need to draw in here. So 36.5 centimetres. I'm going to do that exactly the same on the front and on the back. It's always hard to get everything in, but be close enough for you to see any detail. So I'm going to move this out of shot. So that's my back and my front, and that's the side where the waists are there. So I'm just sliding it up so you can see the whole skirt part of this. So this is my waistline here at the top, and then this is the hem at the length I want it, and this is now the width of my hem, how I want it at the bottom. So what I don't want to do is just draw a straight line going from my waist to my hem, because I need to think about my hip and the hip curve. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line from this point to this point here, and I would normally do this really light because I'm going to rub it out, but I'll do it a little bit darker so that it shows up in the video. So this just gives me a rough guide of where I want this to be. But as I said, I don't want it to be a perfect straight line. I want it to curve out a tiny bit for the hip, not very much, but I don't want it just going this shape here. So I've drawn that in. I'll show you on the back, and then I'll do exactly the same on the front. So let's turn this sideways so we can see the whole seam. I want to mark where my hip line is. So this is my back piece here. This is my waist. And I'm going to measure down here 23 centimetres, which is roughly where my hip line is. And that's a fairly average measurement. So that is to my widest part of my hip. And I wouldn't, again, normally draw this so dark, but I want you to be able to see it. So this is roughly my hip line here. And then what I need to do is I need to measure my hip. I need to work out how much ease I want on my hip and divide it by 4. And that's the measurement that I need here at the hip line. So I've measured exactly what I want this to measure here. I don't want to add loads of ease. I don't want it really baggy, but I certainly don't want it tight on my hip. So I've taken that measurement and I've divided it by 4, just like I did for the hem. And it's given me a measurement of 30.5 centimetres. So that is where I want this to be on this hip line here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to rub this little bit out here. Like I say, I would only normally do this so I've got a bit of a visual guide when I'm making a pattern. I wouldn't do it really heavy, so that line would completely go. You don't have to draw it in at all if you don't want to, but it just helps explain. So that is where my side seam is going to be between my hip and my hem. And then I need to join this with a curve. But just the same way that I didn't want that being a straight line, I don't want this going to a bit of a point at the waist either. So what I want to do is I want to keep this as it is here, and then I want to smooth out this little shape where it kind of goes in a bit here, and then I want it to curve out in a natural hip shape here. So I'm just going to bring this out a little bit, and I'm not going to use a ruler. I'm just going to do this by eye. So I'm just smoothing. I'm pressing so hard I'm breaking the lead on my pencil, but I want you to see it. So I'm just smoothing that out there so it doesn't go to a point at the waist. And then I'm just continuing that round here. And then what I want to do is join this bit here with a curve so it's all a continual nice shape. I don't want any straight lines on this other than this little bit at the top and this bit at the bottom here. So I'm just turning that around so I can get a good shape. And then I'm just going to use the bend of my ruler to get a nice natural curve on the hip. And now if I put that back where it was, you can see it's not that far off the straight line that I drew, but you've just got a bit of shaping here for the hip. You don't want it sitting really tight on the high hip. You've got the right amount of ease on the fullest bit of the hip, so you know it's not going to be tight there. And then it's not quite as extreme where it goes into the A-line. So depending on the shape of how you want this, if you want it to flare out quite a bit, you might not need to worry so much about this, and it might be straighter. If you want it more fitted and more straighter, then it's going to shape in a little bit more straight at the bottom. But you can do this shape however you want. You just want to make sure you've got the right hip curve. You can do another measurement up here to check it if you want as well. But just make sure you've got enough ease on the waist and on the hip, and you've got the length and the width you want at the hem. So that's my side seam now done on my back, and I'm just going to do exactly the same on the front. So I can either take measurements or I can just trace this off. So that's both my side seams done now, back and front. The shapes are a little bit different because obviously the front and the back on my bodice are a little bit different. So that's those done, and you can see at the bottom here that it goes to quite a point. When I join those up, it's going to mean the side seams at a real point, but what I'm going to do is when I cut these out in a minute, I'm going to correct that. So don't worry about that for the minute. So let's just put the skirt bit aside and pull this back down, and I now need to think about the styling for the top. I don't have an awful lot to do to change it from my block to my pattern. I'm going to be changing the neck. I'm going to be keeping the armholes basically as they are because I really like the wide armholes, particularly on this kind of 60s inspired shift. If I want to lower the armhole more once I try a sample on, I can do that, no problem. The main thing I need to do is play around with the darts and change the neck. So I can't do my neck until I've moved the dart because it's in the way. So the next thing I'm going to do is that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these out. I know now that I'm not having to make this any wider on the shoulder. I've added my ease in here and I've done my hips. So let's just get these cut out and then we can finish the styling on the back and the front of the bodice parts of the dress. So you can now see exactly what I've got. So this is my front and this is my back. So the first thing I'm going to do, which is really easy, you can see now what I was saying about this. So the first thing I'm going to do is just line it up at the waist and just match these up from there. As you can see, it doesn't now match up at the hem, and that's just because the curve is slightly different, so it throws it off a little bit. And what I need to do now that I was saying before is I don't want that point, but I can make these the same length as each other at the same time as getting rid of the point. So all I'm going to do is just smooth that off a little bit there. It's going to look really strange going to a point, and it's going to be a little bit longer at the side as well if I do that. So I'm going to do this, and then when I come to do the hem in a bit, I will explain what to do with the seam allowance to make sure that this sits perfectly at the side. So you can imagine once that now comes off, it's going to look a lot better. So let's get this trimmed off and have a look. And there we go. You can see straight away that looks so much better. As I'm looking at it on the screen, it actually looks like it goes to more of a point than it does when I'm looking at it, just looking down at the table. But the best way to make sure that's correct is when you try a sample on. I'm definitely making a sample of this because when you're doing any kind of colour blocking, it's always a really good idea just to use up your scraps and see if you like the proportions of what you've done. So I will double check this when I do that in a minute. So back to the top and the darts. So I don't want this to be super fitted. My dart at the back here is only small, and to not have it really fitted, I'm actually just going to get rid of this dart completely. I can always bring it in a little bit at the waist on the side when I try my sample on if I want to, but I'm just going to get rid of this one. For the front though, I don't want to get rid of all of the shaping because I've got quite a big difference between my bust and my waist. If I have my dress just go straight down from the bust, I always feel like it's a bit shapeless. If you don't have a massive difference, then it's a really nice 60s kind of shape to just have no waist shaping at all. But if you're more curvy, like me, you might want a little bit of a dart. So I'm just going to leave that as it is for now, and then I'll decide what to do with that in a second. So you've got the option of just rubbing it out completely and not worrying about that next step, or just leaving it there like I am for now. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to close this dart up here. I don't want a dart going to my shoulder. I want a dart going to the side, which is pretty standard. And on a shift dress, this is exactly where a dart generally goes most of the time. So all I'm doing is just drawing a line from the side. It's about, I think, 4.5 centimetres maybe. That was a pretty good guess. 4.5 centimetres down from the armhole to the bust point here. And all I'm going to do is cut here, and then close that dart up. And then all I need to do is just swing that around there. And that joined together is the equivalent of sewing that dart up. And it's moved my dart to the side where I want it. So I'm just going to use a couple of bits of tape to hold that in place. And then what I'm going to do just to make this a bit more sturdy is stick a little bit of paper behind here as well. So I'll just get that done and trim this bit off, and then we can carry on with the styling. That's now done, and you'll see I've got this pointy shape on the dart here, and all I did was folded this so that these two lines meet up how they will be when it gets sewn up, and I just cut that in one go, and then it automatically puts it in the right shape. Just make sure that the dart goes in the direction it's going to be going when you make it, so generally you want it pointing down towards the hem. The next thing I need to do is my neck. So I've marked this on here. It's 1.75 centimetres across from the original neck shape, because I just want to open it up a little bit, and then by eye I just want to draw this in a good shape. I'm going to keep it high at the back. I'm not having this go any lower, and I'm just going to kind of play around with that until I think it looks a good shape. And that looks fine for now. And then I need to do exactly the same on the front. So I've drawn this in 1.75 here, and I've worked out that I want to drop it by 2 centimetres at the centre front. And again, I just want that to be a good shape. Can't draw over the tape that I've put on very well. And I'm gonna just hold these together, and then I'm gonna put my front next to my back and line them up at the neck there, because I want to make sure this is a continuous good shape. I tend to draw them separately and then put them together to finish it off. So I just want it to be a really nice rounded shape. I've now ended up with quite a dark feathery line, because I normally draw really light, and then once I've got it right I'll draw over it heavier. But so you could see, I've been drawing quite hard, so that's why that's quite thick. And I'm just using a pen to go over the bit where the tape is, because I couldn't draw on it. So I need to now just finalise this shape. It's gone a little bit funny there, and then I can get this cut out. I'm happy with the way that now looks, so I'm just gonna get this cut out, and that's my neck shape done. Now that I've got my neck cut out to the size I want it, I can draw on the colour blocking how I want it. So I've been playing around in the mirror, holding bits of tape and bits of fabric up, things like that, just to work out how wide I want this to be. So I'm going with 4 centimetres, because I want it to be the same around the neck as what it is down the centre front and centre back. And any smaller than 4 centimetres, it looks a little bit insignificant. I want it to be really, really bold. I don't want to go any bigger though. So all I'm going to do is from this edge here, I'm just going to draw little points 4 centimetres from there. If when I try my sample on I decide that I want my neck drop higher or lower or wider or any of that, I'll have to just stick this back on and then adjust it and redraw it in. But I'm pretty sure that neck shape is perfect, so I'm just gonna go ahead and do this at 4 centimetres from the edge that I've created. So I will do exactly the same on the back, and then on my centre front and centre back it's going to be 4 centimetres, but obviously this is half of my pattern, so I'm just going to do this 2 centimetres from the centre front and the centre back, and I'll continue that all the way down to the hem. So I've got these bits now drawn on, the front is ready to go. I'm going to cut this out in a second. So I'm basically going to have a neck piece here and a centre front piece, which are in my contrast colour, and then this is in my main fabric. And then I'll do exactly the same on the back. The only last little thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move this dart. It's quite close to where my trim is going on here. If you've only got a small dart, you might be able to actually take a little bit off either side and get rid of the dart. But my dart is fairly wide, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to move the whole dart over a little bit, just so it's not sitting too close to that seam. So all I'm going to do is just mark it 3/4 centimetre or 7.5 millimetres from each point, and then I will rub this one out and I'll redraw in my dart. So that dart there is just a better position because it's just not as close to that seam. When you've got a patterned fabric, you don't even notice the dart anyway. So this all depends how big your dart is, how wide your trim is. You might be able to get rid of it, or you might need to keep a dart there. So this is all now ready to cut out. So I need to make sure I label everything up perfectly so I don't forget what's what once I've cut it out. So that's my front and my back, and then this trim is my front here, so I'm going to mark where the centre front is because I need to make sure I put the right side on the fold, because obviously I've got this little curve here where it joins onto the neck trim, and I'm also just going to write top so I don't get confused which way up it goes. It's just going to be a little strip and it could get quite confusing. And then on the back I'm just going to mark where the centre back is and where the top is. If you find this a little bit fiddly to cut on the fold, being such a skinny bit, you can always trace this off and draw this centre front one, double the width, and just cut a single one out. If you're not having a front dart here on the bit between the bust and the waist, and you've rubbed that out, then you're ready to go. You can start cutting out. If, like me, you want to keep a little bit of a dart, then just follow this next step as well. So I don't want it to come in anywhere near as much as this. It's not a fitted dress. I just want a little bit of shape so it doesn't just hang straight from my bust point to the hem. So I'm gonna half the size of this dart. So it currently measures 4 centimeters. There's my center point there, and I want it to measure 2 centimeters. So they're the new points there. And all I need to do is just rub this out and draw the new points in. So the reason I found the centre point as well is because I need to extend it down to finish it off. So I'm just going to draw a line from the bust point through that centre point and continue down here. And my dart, I'm going to draw 11 centimetres long, and I'm just going to join all of these points. You never want the dart going all the way to the bust point, so I'm going to draw it to about here. I can always change that when I try my sample on. And my side dart here, I'm going to put a little mark here, and that's where the end of this one is. I'm going to draw my side dart on a little bit clearer so you can see exactly where I'm sewing. So the same distance from the bust point that I've drawn down here, I'm doing to the side because I don't want this sewn all the way to the bust point. You can sew it to the bust point if you want to. It gives it that very kind of pointy 60s kind of look if that's what you want, but I prefer mine to be a bit softer rather than really pointy like that. So this is where this one goes to, and this is where this one goes to. I'm just going to label this the centre front as well here, and this is my back. So I'm going to cut all of these pieces out now, and you'll be able to see it when it's broken up how it looks. I've had to overlap it a little bit to get it all in, but I wanted to just show it like this because it's really clear now what's what. So my neck trim gets cut on the fold here, and then this strip gets cut on the fold, or you can just cut another strip the same and stick them together because it might be easier to cut out. Depends what kind of fabric you've got really. And this is my front with my 2 darts. And then my back, I've only got this little dart at the top because I'm not putting any back shaping in here. I need 2 pieces of this because I'm going to have my zip at the centre back, and then 2 pieces of my back neck trim. So I'm just going to mock this up using any pieces of fabric that I have. Any kind of things like this where you're using lots of little bits are a great way of using up any leftovers, which is why I never throw anything away unless it's tiny. So I'm going to mock this up now. My sample's going to look a little bit funny because it's going to be all different colours, but I want to check that I'm happy with the fit. I want to check that I'm happy with this dart position, with my neck size, and with my little dart at the front, that it's got enough shape. And I want to check that I'm happy with the proportion of my colour blocking. So I'm going to get this sewn up now, and then we can have a look and see how it looks. So this is my sample. Obviously, as I said, I've just used random bits of fabric that I've got left over from other projects. Great way to use them up. So although my dress is going to have the opening at the centre back, I can't pin this on very well because it's quite high necked at the back. So I've just done an opening at the side just for the sake of fitting the sample. So that's why you can see it sticking out a little bit at the side here. So I can't see exactly how it's going to look, but it's giving me a really good idea of how the colour blocking is going to look. I'm really happy with the proportion of it. One of the things to check is that you're happy with the neck, because what you don't want to do is get all of this colour blocking done and then you're not happy with how the neck actually fits on you. So I'm happy with that. I'm really happy with the armholes. There's just a few other little tweaks that I'm going to do to make sure that I really love this dress once it's finished. So before I started filming this, I've already put all the pins in ready. I spent a bit of time in the mirror deciding what I liked, what I didn't like, what I wanted to change. So the first thing is I'm going to just make it a bit shorter. I think it's out of shot, but if I just lift it up like this, you can see I have just put some pins in the hem to the length that I want it. I just checked that and it was completely out of shot, so I've attempted to zoom out a little bit, but you can see here I've just pinned it up a few centimetres just to be the exact length that I want it. So it's just coming up a little bit, but the whole point of this dress is it's a shift, it's a bit 60s style. I don't want it too long and sensible. So that's the hem. I'll go through all of these little amendments in a minute with the dress on the table so you can see exactly what I'm doing against the pattern. So that's the hem. And then one of the things that I've done, which was quite important, is the hip here. So I've added a little dart in the back. I'll go through that in a second, but I'm just going to go through these in order of how I'm going to amend it. And this hip, you can see a few little stitches here, and that's where I unpicked it. That's where the seam originally was, and all I did was I unpicked from here to here, and then I've re-sewn it to add a little bit into the back. That will all be really well explained in a minute when you see me doing it with the pattern, but that's just meant that it's not pulling across here. It was pulling slightly because it was just too straight on the hip on the back. So that is something to consider. I'll show you how to do that in a second. And then at the top, I let this out. I put a little bit of ease in it because I didn't want it too fitted, but it was just a bit too baggy right at the top. I've kept it how it is with the extra ease at the waist, and then I've just taken it back in a little bit at the top. So it's just shaped, so it just really gradually comes out and it's nice and loose around the middle. So that is the side seam adjustments and the hem, and then the other thing is the darts. When I looked down to show you what I was doing to this side dart here, I noticed that the pins had fallen out, which is not ideal. So I've quickly put the pins in where I'm pretty sure they were, but you'll see with the pattern exactly where they were when I really did pin this properly. So I've got one here which is just below the point of the dart, and one that's a fair bit lower at the side. And this is because when I looked in the mirror, because it's not fitted around the waist, it just gives the appearance that this side dart is a little bit high. If it was really fitted and it came in here, it would hold all of this in place and that dart would look correct. But it just visually looks a bit high. So I'm just going to lower the whole dart. It's not going to change the fit. I'm really happy with the fit. It's just so that line is in a slightly different position. So I'll show you how to do that, and I'll show you from the original pins that were in there before these ones fell out. And then I'll also show you what these pins are here on this front dart. All I'm doing, I'm about to lose another one now. All I'm doing is I'm moving that dart across more towards the side. And the reason for this is because I've got this stripe here. The dart, if you look on this side, it just appears too close to this bit and then too far from here. I just want it to be a little bit more centered. So it's moving over very slightly, and I'm just going to make it not quite as long, top and bottom. Really, really simple adjustment. And then at the back, whereas I had decided it wasn't going to have a dart at the back because I wanted it to be this true kind of 60s shape that doesn't have all this fit in it, I'm not straight up and down. I'm quite curvy, and my hips compared to my waist is a big difference. So without this dart, I just felt like it was really, really unflattering. So I've just added this little dart in, which is in a similar place to where the original dart on my block was. It's just nowhere near as wide. So it just gives a little bit of shape so it doesn't feel a bit like a sack. So that's all the adjustments on. Let's have a look now with the sample on the table, and we'll go through each of those and what to do with the pattern. Let's go through each of the things that I need to change one at a time. So I've left the pins all here to indicate where I need to move the darts. I've got my pins at the bottom to indicate the hem and taking in at the sides, and then this dart at the back. So let's do them one at a time. The good thing is I'm really happy with the bold stripe and the bit around the neck, so I don't need to do anything with that. These are just minor adjustments. So it doesn't matter what order we do these in, let's just do one at a time. So the hem is incredibly straightforward. All I need to do is just take off the bottom of my pattern how much I've pinned up. So I just usually take an average measurement because when I'm pinning it on myself it might not be 100% accurate. So it's around 4 centimetres. So all I need to do on my pattern is if I just separate these, is I just need to take 4 centimetres off each one. So that just needs to go all the way around, front and back, and then obviously at the side where I checked that it was a good shape before, I just need to make sure when I shorten this it continues to be a good shape. So I'm just going to draw these in all the way to the centre front and centre back, and then I can trim that off. And that's the hem done already, nice and quick. Let's have a look next at the back hip. So this is the bit here where it was pulling. It was a little bit tight, so it just shows that this is a little bit too straight here. I just need to add a little bit of a curve on the high hip. So if you have a look here, you can see I've ironed a crease where the original seam was. So hopefully you can see nice and clearly what I've added in. It's not come out particularly straight, but you can see where I've left the stitches in from where I unpicked it and where the crease is, how much I need to add in. So all I'm going to do is just, if I turn it that way, lay this on the pattern, and I know that it's absolutely fine at this point here at my waist, and it's absolutely fine at this point here. So it's just this bit in between where I need to add it. And what I'm going to do is find the widest part of where I've added, which is here. And I'm going to measure from the new stitch line to where this crease is. So that's 8mm. I'm just going to write that on there for now. So I need to just add some curve that makes this stay a good line with a natural curve and going into the waist, but it needs to come out at this point here. I'm not changing the front because when I unpicked it and sewed it back up, I kept the front in exactly the same place. It's just the back I added to. So if I have a look on the inside, so looking at the inside now, this is the same part we've just been looking at. So you can see this is the front, that nothing's changed. It's maintained the 1.5 centimetres seam allowance. But if you look on the back, that crease there is what I was just looking at on the outside. And you can see the difference here. That is how much I've let it out on the back. So let's just put the sample aside for now. And all I need to do is just stick a little bit of paper on there and redraw it. I've stuck this little bit of paper behind, and then at this point here, where I measured was the widest bit I'd added on, which was 8mm. I'm just going to measure that 8mm from where the previous seam line is to that bit there. And then this is what I now need to just reshape into the skirt. So I didn't need to add any in there, but I obviously need to keep this as a good line. So I've drawn that there, and it doesn't quite meet up with that seam there, but I'm going to trace all this off in a minute so I can correct that rather than sticking a bit of paper all the way down. And then I just need to do the same up here. I just need to play around with this until the shape is a nice natural line and curve. So I'm going to have to just add a little bit in at the waist just because I can't make this a weird shape. I can't have this suddenly just go in and back out again. I need to have this a good shape, but I have to add some fullness here or it's never going to sit right. The back is always going to end up pulling. And that looks a much better shape. So it carries on from there and then it curves out and it meets up with this hip point here where I don't want to add any in. I need to just extend it down a little bit where it doesn't match up here. If I just cut that at the point, because my line has got a bit wavery, let's just cut the whole thing off so we can see the shape. You'll be able to see it a lot better against the table. So this stays a nice line here and then it just doesn't match up quite there, but when I trace it off I can just continue that to the bottom. So that's my little bit added in for my hip that's going to make that sit a lot better. So now I'm just looking at the side here. So I added, I don't know if you can see the faint line here, which was the original seam, and I added the ease in because I didn't want it too fitted, but actually at the top it made it a bit too loose. I like how it fits at the waist. I like how it fits to this point here. So basically I need to just translate from my sample onto my pattern. There's no seam allowance on this armhole, so I'm lining it up at the top. and I just need to take this back in again. So at the top here, it's exactly how much I added on, so I can just draw that where my previous line was. And I want this to be a straight line, so this point here is where I'm no longer taking it in. So all I'm going to do is just join this point to this point here, and then I want it to continue down to where the waist is, which actually works perfectly. So I just need to shave that little bit off there. I'm going to take this little bit out from behind that's sticking out, and I'm going to take this off here, and then I just need to do exactly the same on the front. I'll put my sample aside for now, and I'm going to use this little sliver that I've taken off to just do exactly the same on the front. So the little sliver that I've cut off the back, I'm going to use to draw on the front what I need to take off. So I'm just going to place it over the top here, and where my dart is, I'm just going to put a little line on there because I'm going to shift this down in a second. So I'm just going to trace around it for how much to take off. So that bit there needs to come off. And where I drew the little line where I went over where the dart was, I can now line that up with the other side of the dart. And all I'm going to do is mark the top there. I can't draw on it very well because I've got loads of tape on it. And then this is the position here where I don't need to take it in anymore. And I can just do exactly like I did at the back and just join those points. So I just need to trim that off, and then obviously I need to just trim off a little bit from the dart as well. So I'm just taking off basically exactly the same as I have on the back, and I've just worked around the dart. And there we go, that's the front done. So looking at it again with the front and the back, this has now been adjusted. I've not let the waist out at all, other than just trying to continue this as a good shape here. I've just taken it back in at the top. So the last thing I need to do is just make sure that my side seams still are the same length. So I'm just gonna match them up at the top and mark where the dart is there, so I can line it up again there. And my waists don't quite match up, so what I'm going to do is just slide that down so that they do now match up, and I'm going to rub out that little mark on there. I'm going to mark where my dart is, and then I'm going to line it up there. I hope this makes sense. And the difference here, I don't want to make the back any lower. I'm going to bring the front up, but I need to make sure they both measure the same. And when you start doing adjustments like this, it can just throw things off a little bit. So when I trace this off, I need to just add 2 millimeters to the height here. I can stick a little bit on and do it now before I trace it off if I like, but it's such a tiny amount that by just writing a note like this, it'll remind me to do that when I trace it off. And then just turning it to the side, I'm going to do exactly the same and just match up the waist and make sure it still matches up at the bottom, which it does. Adding this little bit of curve in here hasn't affected the length of that. So all I have left to do is just playing around with the darts. Let's do one dart at a time. There's quite a bit going on now with this pattern, so I'm gonna draw this now in green so that you can clearly see the difference. So looking at the side dart, I like the length of the dart, I like where it finishes here. I'm just gonna move it down a little bit because it's not quite as fitted as what the bodice block is. It just gives the appearance that this dart is quite high, and I want it just to sit a little bit lower. So I'm gonna lower it by 9 millimeters here, so it's not a huge amount, but just visually it looks better when it's on. If I move it down, and I need to move it down here, so I'm going to go to this point here, which is where the actual seam is, where I've pinned it on, and I'm moving that down by 3 centimeters, and that's nothing to do with the fit, that's just visually I think it's going to look nice. So I just need to join those 2 points together. And that's now where you're going to see the dart in relation to the bottom bit here. And I need to just work out where the other side of it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue that. Even though that's the end, I've just continued it. And I'm going to continue this dart here as well. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut along my new line where I want my dart to be, up to the point where these two bits met. And I'm going to use yet another colour because it's starting to get a little bit confusing. But the point where they met here, I'm going to join up with the original bottom of the dart. And I'm going to cut up there. And then all I'm going to do, so I've basically, let's turn it back the right way again. I just did that so I could cut it out. So this is my new dart position and this is my old dart position at the top. So I'm going to close the old dart up. So this top bit here is the original top part of the dart. And I'm closing it up with the original bottom part of the dart. And I'm just going to stick that together. And then this little bit you can see behind, I'm just going to fold that back. And that's now my new dart position. So what I need to do when I'm tracing this off, if I go back to green again, this is the point here that I marked before, which is the length of the dart, which is this point here, which is the same position. The whole dart has just moved down a little bit. It hasn't changed the size, it hasn't changed the fit. I've literally just moved it down a little bit. So the end of my dart is going to be in the middle of where this is here. And I'll draw that in properly when I trace it off in a second. And again, for the front dart, I'm going to just draw it in a different colour so you can see what I'm doing in relation to this dart here. A few people ask me on my videos why I don't use pen so my patterns show up more. This bit coming up is a great example of why I use a pencil and why you should always use a pencil to draft patterns. You can see that I make a little bit of a mess of my dart and I can't rub it out. I've kept this in my video because I always like to show my mistakes because it shows how easy it is to make a mistake. So bear with me that this bit is a little bit of a mess, but it's a great example of why you want to be using pencil. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm making it shorter. I'm not going up as high and I'm not coming down so low. So first thing I'm going to do is mark the end points. So it's coming up by 4.5 centimetres. So the original point is here. So I'm just going to measure up 4.5 centimetres. And at the top, it's coming down by 3 centimetres. So that's my original point. And I'm coming down 3 centimetres. I'm not changing the fit of this at all. I'm literally just making it shorter and I'm moving it to the side a little bit. So I'm just going to measure where my pins are in relation to the dart I currently have, and it's 3/4 centimetre or 7.5 millimetres. So all I need to do is just measure across from each of the points, so both sides of the dart, that amount, 7.5 millimetres, and that gives me the new position. Make sure you go the correct way. I'm going away from the centre front, and the same at the top here. But my new centre point of the dart is here because that's my new height. So I'm measuring 7.5 millimetres from that point there. And the same here, I'm measuring from the centre of the dart at the new height that I've measured. So these are my new points here. It's a much shorter dart, but it's coming in exactly the same amount at the waist. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to rub this out a little bit so you can just see it a little bit fainter so we can compare it. And this is why I'm going to trace all this off in a minute, because it just starts getting a bit confusing when you've got all these old lines. And I'm going to draw this in and see how it looks. My guess at this stage is that looks a little bit short and wide at the bottom there. So I might make it a little bit longer. But I just want to show my train of thought as I'm doing it, because sometimes until you actually see what you've got, you don't know. I do think it looks very short here. So all I'm going to do is just extend that down a little bit and redraw that in. It's only about a centimetre longer, but it's just going to make it a less extreme shape. Looking at it now, it looks like my dart's going off at a slight angle, so I'm just going to check my centre point, make sure I haven't made a mistake, because it's very easy to do when you end up with all these lines. I always like to keep my mistakes in, so you can see that this has gone off. So this is my dart point here. Rather than measuring at the top and the bottom, I'm just going to go by the centre point here when I trace this off. Now, I'm sorry that this has become a little bit of a mess. So let's just make this really clear. Yeah, another colour. There is my top point there. These are my new midpoints. And that is the bottom of this dart. So all I've done is I've just moved the whole dart across by 7.5mm, and I've made it a little bit lower at the top and a little bit higher at the bottom. So that's the front dart done, and the last one we need to look at is the dart that I've added into the back. So now that it's on the table, you can see this dart that I've added it in a lot better. It's only tiny, but it's enough just to give that a little bit of shape at the back. I just felt like for my figure, having a very big hip compared to waist ratio, it was just too shapeless for me. So depending on what kind of body shape you have, you might want to just stay without a dart at the back. If I could, I would, because I like that style, but it just doesn't suit me. So all I'm going to do is line up my armhole there to get this in the right position, and there, then where my waistline is there, I'm just going to follow that along and put a pin in here so that I can now translate this nice and easily. So all I need to do, nice and easy, is measure how far across the fold is when I fold it over like that. So it's 8cm. So that is the centre of my dart, and that's from this edge, which is where my colour block is. So that is the centre point. And then I need to measure how wide I'm doing this at the waist, and 7.5mm. I seem to be measuring everything 7.5mm on this pattern. Bit of a coincidence. So that is the midpoint of my dart there. And then I just need to mark where the top and bottom is. So I'm going up to this point here. So it's not quite as high as the original dart. And I'm just going down to here, which isn't particularly long for a waist to hip dart, but obviously it's only very narrow. So all I'm going to do now is line this up with my dot and cross to get my centre points at the top and bottom, which is exactly what I should have done on the front. And then I can just join these up. So the dart is pretty much where the original dart on my bodice block was. It's just moved slightly this way. I did it by eye when I had it on, and it's moved it slightly that way. And this is because visually it just looks better a bit further from the colour blocking. So that's exactly what I did on the front, was just moved it over. And it's things like that that when you're making the paper patterns, you can't see how it's going to look. This is why I make samples, so I can see how it looks on the body. So that's the back dart done. I'm not doing anything with this dart. I'm happy with how that looks. So this is all now ready to trace off. That's all my pattern pieces now adjusted, other than just little things like the dart positions and where I need to fill in a little bit at the top here. So because they've all got a bit confusing with moving things around and these bits are very skinny, I'm going to trace everything off. And for my centre front, I'm going to double this over so I'm not cutting this on the fold. And then I'm just going to add the seam allowance to all of these pieces so it's nice and quick to cut out. So the first thing I need to do is just trace everything off exactly as it is. I won't bore you by having to watch me do that. So I will get all of this traced off and then we can have a look at it. I've traced everything off now. So let's just look at every piece one at a time. So my little neck pieces for the colour blocking are pretty straightforward. So I've just got the centre front and centre back. I've just traced around them, and then I just need to add my seam allowance on. So none at the centre front because it's on the fold, 1.5 centimetres all the way around the other two pieces. When I'm paneling all this up, I'm going to have my bold piece sewn into the front and the back, and I want it to balance up perfectly with my bold piece on my neck. So I'm going to put a little mark here, and that's going to be a notch that I cut when I cut this out to make sure that everything lines up perfectly. And for my back piece, what I've done is I've just traced around it exactly as it is. I've marked the position of the dart at the top. And then for the dart positions, the easiest way of doing this, you don't need any little gadgets, is just using a pin. So make sure it's in position perfectly, and then where each of the points are, just push the pin through and through the bit of paper below it, and then you've got your mark for where your darts go. So these are definitely not going to show up on the video, so I'm just going to draw little crosses where they are so you can see. I'm struggling to see them myself now. I can feel that one. And there's the other one. And then that's my little dart point there. And then at the top. So those are all the points where my pin went through, and you don't need to do that. It's just so you can see it. And then all I need to do is just draw in my dart, and I'll do the same for the one on the shoulder, and then this is ready just to add my seam allowance on to cut out. I always press hard so you can see it, and I always rip the paper, so don't do that. So I'm going to do the same with the dart at the top, and then I'm just going to add 1.5 centimetres all the way around for the seams, and at the bottom I'm going to add 3 centimetres for my hem. When I come to this point here, what I want to do is on this line here, I'm just going to fold that up a little bit, and I'm just tracing off the shape of the side seam, and then hopefully you can see that coming through, and that's the shape I want that to be. I don't want to carry on going out because then I'll have excess fabric when it folds up. So that's how I'm going to do that, and I'll just draw this 3 centimetres all the way around for my hem. My front is exactly the same as the back, adding the hem and the seam allowance all the way around. And then what I've done when I've traced it off here is where I put my little note to add 2 millimetres. I've just drawn this up a little bit higher, put it in the right position, or it looks like I've added a lot more on, and I've redrawn that in. And then my side dart, I've put my position there where my arrow points to and marked my new points here. And then I've just done exactly the same thing as at the back, and I've put my pin through on all of my points so I can draw the dart in. You could use this piece if you want to, but for me, there's so much going on with the adjustments and different pen lines that if I go to use this pattern in 6 months' time, I'm going to get really confused. So that's why I'm tracing it all off. The last 2 pieces are my stripes that go up the front and the back. So my centre back, I'm just going to trace this off exactly as it is, and it just needs a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance and then the 3 centimetres at the hem. And with my front, rather than cutting such a long skinny piece on the fold, which is going to be a bit fiddly, all I'm going to do is I'm going to trace around it, and I'm going to flip it over and trace around it again, and I'll just draw this as 1 point. So I'll get that traced off and then show you exactly how that looks. My centre front and centre back colour block pieces are now traced off, and this just looks like a series of lines now. So I'll just go through one at a time what I've done. So let's just put the front one aside. This is my front and this is my back. So what I'll do, I'll zoom in and let's just have a look at this at the top so you can see a lot clearer. So I've traced off the centre back here, and I've just put a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance the whole way around. And if I show you the bottom, I've added my 3 centimetre hem onto that. So the centre back is pretty straightforward. And then let's have a look at the top of the centre front. So I didn't want to have to fold my fabric and cut this skinny bit because it's just fiddly. So what I've done is I've traced around it, and then this line in the middle is my centre front line. I've flipped it over and traced around it again. For these, rather than literally tracing around it, I've taken the measurements and just used my dot and cross to draw all these parallel lines. So this is the centre front here, folded over, so it's double the width, so it's 4 centimetres there, which is the finished size, plus a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance either side. So if you want to, you don't even need to draw all of these lines. You can just work out the total width and the total length, and that's what you need. I've added the hem at the bottom, the same as the back, and then at the top here you really need to make sure you get this shape right, because this shape here is what joins onto the neck piece. If I get my neck piece and put it on there, you can see that's where that's got to join on. So you don't want this to have a straight top because it's not going to fit perfectly. You need to have that curve. So that's my centre, front and back, ready to cut out now. So I'm just going to get all of my pieces now cut out and we can have a look at them. I've got all my pattern pieces now cut out, so they're much neater. I can see the darts really clearly. I can see exactly what's what. So for my back, this is my main fabric with the darts on, 3 centimetres at the bottom for the hem and 1.5 centimetres seam allowance all the way around. And then my colour blocked piece for the back, same hem and seam allowance all the way around. And then this is the centre back line here. This is where my zip is going to go. You can put a zip at the side if you don't want to break up this piece, but I always just find dresses more comfortable with the zip at the back. And then of course my colour block piece for my neck, just 1.5 centimetres all the way around. And then for my front, much clearer now that I've cleaned this up and it doesn't have all of those lines on, so you can see exactly what's what. So I need 2 pieces for my front, and my centre front colour block piece, you can see where I've drawn the one and then flipped it over, seam allowance all the way around, and the same 3 centimetre hem at the bottom. And then my centre front neck piece is going to be cut on the fold. You could flip this over and draw that as one big piece if you want, but I'm quite comfortable cutting that like that. And then for the lining, I'm going to do it fully lined because I don't want to feel all the seams of this colour blocking. The lining is going to make it feel much nicer to wear. All I'm going to do is, if I fold down my seam allowance on my centre front there, where it joins onto the front, and then if I fold this in half here, you can draw a separate piece if you want, but I just don't want to have to draw a whole nother set of pieces. It's a little bit unnecessary. All I'm going to do is fold that, fold this seam allowance down, and then this is my seam line here, which joins onto this seam line here of the front, and obviously do that all the way down, and then I can just cut one piece of the lining fabric on the fold. So that's the principle of doing the lining, just to cut it in one piece. And then just to look at the back again, exactly the same principle for the lining. This is my seam line here and seam line here. I don't need to fold anything. I'm just going to line that up like that. And that's what my back piece of lining is going to look like. I'm gonna do the lining for my neck pieces in the black because I don't want the lining to poke out of the neck in a pale colour, but I want to line the rest in a pale colour because I don't want it to show through. Now all the amendments are done and I know the pattern fits perfectly. Let's get on with cutting out all the fabric and making this dress. So obviously you've already seen the fabrics because you've seen the picture on my thumbnail and me at the beginning wearing it. But just to have a nice close-up look, these are the fabrics. I've got my butterfly print and my solid black colour block. My butterfly fabric is quite see-through. It's really lightweight and I don't want my dress to be see-through, obviously. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back this with a plain white cotton, just to make it a little bit less see-through and more similar in weight to my slightly heavier black cotton. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut all of my fabric out of my butterflies and of my black and of my lining, and then we can start layering things up and assembling the dress. I've got all of my outer fabric now cut out. So I have got my 2 back pieces, 2 front pieces, 2 centre back colour block pieces, and then my centre front I've just cut 1 piece because I've already folded that over when I made the pattern. And what I've done for my neck is, for the front and the back, I've cut 2 pieces. So this is the whole neck opened up, and I've cut 1 for the inside and 1 for the outside, because what I'm going to do on the inside is this is all going to be lined in a pale colour, and then I want the facing on my neck to be black. I had considered using a lining fabric, but I want this to be a little bit more sturdy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same fabric for the inside. So I wanted to show you all of these pieces before I now take my pattern pieces off to cut out my lining. So the only thing I'm not doing at the moment that I would normally do at this stage is I'm not going to mark out my darts, because I want to back this with some plain cotton and then I'm going to just lay the pattern pieces back over it to mark the dart positions. So I'm going to take these pieces off now and get my lining cut out, and I'll show you how I'm doing that, just putting these pieces together rather than recutting a whole paper pattern for the lining. Before I cut the lining out, I'm just going to show you exactly what I've done. So I'll show you first on the back and then the front. So I basically pinned my back piece on, and then this is the colour block bit that joins at the back. So this is the seam allowance on my main back panel, and this is the seam allowance on the colour block piece. So I basically just overlap those. So if you've got paper that's a little bit see-through, it really helps to line it up perfectly. So if we have a look at the top, let me just zoom in and have a look a bit closer. You can see there where it lines up, and this all lines up at the top. And I can now just cut that all out in one piece. I'm going to mark my darts on these ones because I don't need to do anything else. So all I'm going to do to mark my darts is a couple of snips at the top here, and then for all of the others, just put a pin through. And then on the other side, all I do is put my pin in there, bring it back through the fabric but not the paper, and then I can take that out, and then that's marked through both pieces. If you need any more help on darts, I do have a separate video on how to mark out the darts and how to sew them up. So I'm going to get that one cut out, but let's quickly look at the front as well, as it's slightly different. So all I've done on the front, the rest of it's exactly the same, but I've laid my piece on here, and because this one is the whole of the front rather than half of it, this centre front line here needs to line up with the fold of my fabric. If I lay it underneath, that's basically how it is. And that just sits on there to continue that neckline. So the way I did it was to measure this, which is 2 centimetres. And then when I pinned this on, I measured to make sure that this seam line here was 2 centimetres from the fold. So that is that piece there, and I have, as you can see, already cut that one out. So I'll just get my back cut out, and then I can finally start sewing my dress. There's a couple of things that I want to do slightly differently on my lining to my outer. So this line here is my hemline. That's the finished length of the dress. But I want my lining to sit up from there. I don't want it to be the same length because it's going to poke through as I move. So I really want to have this at least 1 centimetre shorter than my main fabric. So I need to think about how much seam allowance I want for my lining and where it sits in relation to this hem. So if I just draw it on here, so let's do the lining 1 centimetre shorter than the dress. You can have a bigger difference if you want, but I'd rather do it this length and potentially go shorter than cut it too short. So that is the finished length of my lining there. And I generally have a 2 centimetre hem allowance for my lining. I turn it up 1 centimetre twice. So that is where I need to cut for my lining. So if we write on here, cut for the lining and finished for the lining. This is what I can use in the future when I'm cutting this out, when I make another dress with the same pattern. So basically this distance here is 2 centimetres. So that's what I need to trim off my lining to make it the right length. So all I'm going to do is just fold the pattern back. And I don't need to change a pattern for this. It's so straightforward. I'm literally going to trim 2 centimetres off here, and that makes my lining the correct length. If you are making a separate pattern piece for your lining, obviously you can do this on the pattern piece, but it's not really necessary as that's so easy to do. So I'm just going to do exactly the same on the front for that. And the other thing I want to do is when I bag out my armhole, I want my lining to be slightly smaller so it makes sure it sits inside. I don't want it to be different at this point here, so I'm going to keep it as it is from here. And then this seam line on my main fabric, on my lining, it's just going to be slightly further in. And you'll see when I make it up why I do that. It all helps hold the lining on the inside. So just like the bottom, I don't need another pattern piece for doing this. All I'm going to do is just pull this back. And I'm not even going to measure it. I'm going to do it by eye. But from this point here, where it curves, I'm just going to cut this little sliver off. And this is around 2.5mm or 1/4 centimetre. I've done it enough times to know that's the amount that I need to trim off here. You don't have to trim it off, you could just misalign them when you sew it up. But if you trim it off, then it makes it a lot easier for sewing later. So I can just throw that away. And again, I'm going to do exactly the same on the front with the armhole. I can't quite fit them all on screen and have it close enough for you to see any detail, but this is my front lining and facing, darts all marked out, and the same with the back. And then this is all my main fabric. I've not marked the darts out, I'm going to do that in a minute. Once I've layered this up, I've put a pin at the top of my centre front to remember which is the top. It is obvious because it's got a curve, but just good practice to do. And then on my back pieces, the pin marks the top, and then I've put it at the side where it's the centre back to make sure that goes on in the right place. And then obviously my top pieces for my neck. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to layer all of my main fabric up with the white cotton behind it. All I'm going to do to layer these up is I've cut the plain white cotton exactly the same as the main fabric, and I am quite simply just going to join it around the edge and just stitch it together. So I'm just going to pin that all the way around and sew it on all 4 pieces, 2 fronts and 2 backs. I've now got all of my main fabric backed with the white cotton to just make it less see-through and more similar in weight to the black. And what I did was put the pattern back on these pieces to mark out where all of my dart positions are. So if you need any help with how to mark out the darts from the pattern, then there's a link below to my dart tutorial to show you that. And now all I'm going to do is I just need to match up these pins on the waist. That's the centre of my dart. I know that's the end. So I'm just going to pin all of these darts. I can mark that one as the top. So that one's ready to go. And all I do to get the midpoint before I start sewing is just lay a ruler on. I've got that part there because I don't want to go off the straight line. You can put as many or as few pins as you want in there. I've only got a short distance at the bottom here, so I just need to make sure I don't make that too pointy. I just want to round it off at the bottom. So that's the first one pinned, and I just need to get all of these now pinned. So this is my front, so I've got my little dart there and then my one at the side, and then on my back I've got it on the waist part here and on the shoulder. So how many darts you have depends on how fitted you're making your dress. But I'm now going to get all of these darts sewn up and give them a good press before I start blocking the colours together. My darts are now all sewn up, so they're ready to press, but I'm going to press these when I press the next bits in a minute. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my black down my centre front and on my centre back. Before I do it though, I'm going to overlock my edges. I want to press all of these open. If not, I'm going to be adding bulk more to one side than the other, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to get all of these pieces overlocked before I do any more sewing. And I'm also going to be pressing my side seams open. So I'm going to overlock down there as well. And while I'm at it, I might as well overlock my hem. So I'll get all of that overlocking done before I start sewing this up. Everything is now overlocked, so the next thing I need to do is just panel all of my stripes down the front and back. So I'm literally going to put right sides together and stitch this and press it open. And this is why I put my pins on here, because obviously as you look at it, it just looks like a strip. You don't know which is top and bottom, which has got the curve, and which is the centre back and which joins on. So just a simple thing like putting a pin at the top in the centre back there makes me know straight away that that's where they go. So I'm just going to get these sewn on and pressed, and the same with my centre front. Obviously I've just got one on the front that joins the two sides on. So I'll do that, and then I can press all of my darts at the same time. Now that these panels are on the front, I've got all of this ironed out. The next thing is to put my neck pieces on. So I will show you on the front, and then the principle is just exactly the same on the back. So I put my little notches, hopefully you can see that, on my neck piece there, and that's so I can line it up perfectly with this stripe, and it makes it nice and easy. I've got quite a big curve that I need to ease on. So I need to ease this piece here onto that, and I'm not going to be able to do it very easily because I've got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. I could have cut it with a much smaller seam allowance, but I always think if you keep it the same everywhere, then it gets a lot less confusing. So all I'm going to do is snip into this all the way around, and as long as I don't go past about 1 centimetre, then it's not going to cause me any problems. And then I'm going to be able to ease it on a lot easier. And then once it's done, then I'm going to trim down my seam allowance. So if you want to, then do it with a smaller seam allowance on this bit here. It's totally up to you. But like I say, I like to keep mine the same everywhere because it's less confusing. So I've put my pin through where the seam is for the stripe. And I'm going to put it through here, which is right by that little notch. And I'll pin that bit on there. And then I'll do exactly the same on this side. And then at the shoulders, so because of the angle I've got a little bit of overlap there, and then I should be able to ease this on fairly easily now that I've snipped it. So you can see as you do it, these all open up, and that's what allows you to ease it on. What you don't want to do is stretch anything or have to pleat the bigger piece onto the smaller piece. Where the seam is exactly the same size because obviously you've cut the smaller piece off of the big pattern, so you know it fits. It's just a case of putting these little snips in and then easing it on. And if I flip it round, obviously it's a little bit bumpy at the moment because it's pinned, but you can see how that fits on really well. So I'm just going to pin the other side, and I'll do exactly the same on my back with both sides, and I can get those sewn on. I've now got all of these pieces sewn on, so they don't look great at the moment because they need a lot of trimming and pressing, but they're all put on and they eased on pretty easily. So all I'm going to do is trim half of this seam allowance off and then press it open just like all of the other seams that I've been doing, and I'm not overlocking this because it's going to be well and truly hidden in the lining, so it doesn't matter. I had planned on ironing all of this with the seam open, but when I came to do it, it looked a lot better pushing it all up towards the neck. So that's now pressed, and you can see how nice and neat that looks. And from here on, we're pretty much just finishing off a regular shift dress. The next thing I'm going to do is just get my zip in the back. I'm using a concealed zip because I want this stripe to not look like it's been broken up, and by putting a concealed zip in there, it's just going to look exactly the same as the front. I'm struggling to fold that perfectly in the middle, but I'm going to get this zip in now and finish off my centre back seam. So you can either do the same or put a zip in the side if you want this stripe just to be one piece. I just prefer the feel of a dress with a zip in the back. I never like it in the side. So I'm going to get that in. If you need any help putting a zip in, then there's a link above and in the description to my zip tutorial showing you how to put a concealed zip in a dress. Now that I've got my zip in the back, I'm ready to join the front and back. I've got a complete back and a complete front. Just make sure when you put your zip in that this lines up perfectly here, especially if you've got a really bold colour block like this. You don't want this mismatched. So all I'm going to do now is just put the right sides together, and I'm going to sew my shoulders and my side seams. So I'm going to get all of this pinned, and I'm going to really quickly try it on just to make sure I'm happy with the fit, because sometimes when you're making something out of a different weight fabric to your sample, it might fit slightly different. So this gives me the chance just to either make it a little bit tighter or a little bit looser before I sew it up. It should be absolutely perfect, but it's always worth double checking at this point. So all I'm going to do is line these up at the armhole here, line it up at the hem and pin the whole way down. And with the shoulders, exactly the same, but I just want to make sure this lines up perfectly. You want it to look like one continuous trim. You don't want that to be staggered at the shoulder. So just put a pin through the seam on either side, and then when you sew it up, it's going to be absolutely perfect. And if you've got quite a different contrast like I have, use a different colour thread to sew each bit. I know you have to rethread the sewing machine, but it's going to look much better. So I am just going to get both my shoulders and both of my sides sewn up once I've quickly tried it on to check I'm happy with the fit. Okay, so that's it all now panelled up. It's really starting to take shape. Let's now just get the rest of the dress put together, the lining made, everything else that we need to do to finish off this dress. That's the outer part of my dress now done. So it's complete. It's all sewn up at the sides and the shoulders. I've not pressed it yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up the lining and then I'll press it all at the same time. So the only difference with my lining is I don't have the stripe down the front and the back, so it's all just one piece, and obviously the back 2 pieces. So I'll get the darts done, I'll get my shoulders and sides done, and I'll put my neck trim in. Exactly the same process, just without this stripe. And then once I've got my lining piece all put together, the same as my outer bit, then I can start joining my inner and my outer part of the dress together. I've got my lining now all sewn up, so it's, as I said, exactly the same as the outer but without the stripes, and I've just sewn my side seams and overlocked them and pressed them to the back. It's a really thin lining, so I don't need to press these open. It's not bulky doing it like that. And I've done the shoulders exactly the same, pressed open, and then I've left the opening at the back here for my zip, so I've sewn it to just a little bit below where the zip opening goes to. So I now need to join this to the main part of my dress. I'm going to be joining it around the neck and around the armholes where it's all going to be bagged out, and then I need to join it down the back of the zip as well. So to start with, I'm going to join it on the neck, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my main bit of dress the right way round, and I'm going to keep this inside out, and I'm going to put the main dress inside the lining, and by doing that it means I've got my right sides together, and I just need to join it all the way around the neck. So I'm going to pin it at the centre back. I'm not going to be sewing all the way to the centre back, but I'm going to pin it there for now. And then I'm putting a pin, hopefully you can see this with the black, putting the pin through the shoulder seam on the lining and through the shoulder seam on my main bit of dress. And that means that's perfectly lined up. And then I'll do exactly the same on the other side, and then I can just join it around the front. That's all now pinned on, ready to sew, all lined up perfectly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew to about 2.5 centimetres or an inch from the centre back here on both sides, and get that all sewn on 1.5 centimetres from the edge, which is my seam allowance. Just make sure you don't get anything twisted or caught up or any little kind of puckers in this. So I'm going to get that sewn on now. That's all now sewn on, and before I do anything I need to just make sure I haven't got anything caught up, because I'm going to do some snipping. So I want my inner fabric to sit perfectly on the inside, so I'm going to do some understitching. And before I do that, where it's the most curved, I'm just going to put a few snips, because it's going to really help to do the understitching. I'm going to trim this short in a minute. This is just to help me while I'm stitching it. And then what I'm going to do is pull out my main fabric. So looking at this, what I need to do is stitch it on the facing with my seam allowance pushed towards the lining. So I'm just going to put a pin about 1 centimetre, you'll see why in a minute when I finish it off, from where I've stitched that facing on. And I'm just going to go around sewing this about 2 millimetres across from this seam, and this understitching will just help the lining and the facing stay on the inside. If you need any more detail about this, then I have got a separate video of how to do a perfect bagged out neck, and there is a link to this in the description below if you want to see that. But I'm basically just making sure the seam allowance goes that way, sewing all the way through, and it's going to hold all that in place before I do my trimming. And this is how the understitching should look when it's done, and if you go to the inside you can see it holds the seam allowance in the right direction. So the next thing I want to do is just trim a lot of this seam allowance off, because I want my neck to sit really nicely. So where I've stitched it to there, I'm going to leave a little bit of that for now, but I'm just going to trim the rest of this nice and short. If you've got a fabric that frays a lot, then don't go too short on this. And if you've got quite a heavy fabric, you might want to cut both layers of fabric slightly different lengths just to stagger it so you don't have a ridge. But with this kind of cotton, I'm not too worried about that. You also might want to use some interfacing on your neck to give it a really crisp edge. But when I'm making an everyday dress, I don't like the feeling of a really rigid neck, and 2 layers of this fairly kind of, I guess, medium weight cotton is enough. Once I've got that seam allowance turned in as well, that makes it 4 layers on the very edge. It's enough to give it a good finish. So just literally need to do this last little bit, and then we'll have a look at the armholes and we're pretty much done. So let's just turn that around and see how it looks. If I just tuck my lining in there, and you'll see once that's pressed, it looks really nice. And once that's sitting in exactly the right place, the thickness of this is going to be exactly the same as this. But that can sit perfectly on the inside. Once it's pressed, that stitching is going to hold that in. So that's the neck done for now until I do some pressing and I finish off the little bit at the centre back. Let's move on to the armholes. When you're bagging out an armhole, if you've got a really narrow shoulder here, it can get a bit fiddly. But when you've got quite a wide shoulder like this, it's actually pretty easy to do. So let's have a look inside at the lining. If you remember, when I cut the fabric out, I trimmed a little bit off this lining. It was only about 2.5 millimeters, but that is enough to help the lining stay on the inside. What you don't want is to bag it out exactly the same as the neck and end up with a little bit of lining showing. You want that to stay on the inside perfectly, and that's why we want the lining very slightly smaller than the outer. It's only a couple of millimeters, but it's enough to do the job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the bottom of the armhole, at the armpit. And I want to make sure I don't get anything twisted and do this wrong. So what I'm going to do, I've got these flush to each other. That's how it's going to be finished. And I'm going to just tuck that in there so that the right sides are together like that. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's how it's going to be finished. And then when I go to the inside, I know that nothing's twisted. I always work with the heavier fabric underneath and the lighter one on the top. So all I'm going to do is just pin those there, and then I can go back to the outside and take my original pin out. So I know now that I have got this ready to go with nothing twisted. So I'm just going to take that pin out, and I'm going to get this perfect this time. So I'm going to put the pin through the seam and then through the seam on this bit here. So I press the side seam open on my main fabric and towards the back on my lining. So just make sure you've got everything going the right direction. And all I need to do is just work my way up to the shoulder seam. And then once I get nearer the shoulder, I'll just do exactly the same as what I did at the beginning and put my pin through both seams to make sure they're perfectly lined up. And then I can finish that bit off at the top. And if they're not perfectly matching, you know, you just need to ease them on. It might just be that you've not pinned them perfectly evenly. They're exactly the same size, so they will fit perfectly. And there we go, just a few little rejigs of the pins, and that fits perfectly. So all I'm going to do now is just sew up 1.5 from the edge, which is my seam allowance, all the way from the side seam up to the shoulder. And that's now sewn up, and all I need to do is trim my seam allowance, or you can just cut snips into it so it fits perfectly around that curve. You want it to sit nice and flat when you turn it the right way. So my lining is fairly see-through. I can see that that's sewn on okay and nothing's got caught up, so I can just give that a trim. I'm going to start just a little bit down from the shoulder, and I can go fairly short with this, and then I'll stop just before I get to that side seam where I started sewing it. If in doubt, just trim a little bit off and then turn it around, and then you can always go back in and cut more off. You don't want to cut it too close and then things end up fraying. So once that's turned the right way round, you can now see how that's going to look. Obviously it needs a good press, but we've got the beginnings of our armhole. So we just need to do the other side. So I'm just going to go back to the inside, and I've already obviously got my side seam and my shoulder in the right place. All I need to do is exactly the same on this side. So I'm just going to pin this on just like I did before. It's easier once you do the second side because you've already got your start and finish in the right place. You've just got to put these ones in between. And that's now ready to sew. So I'm just going to sew and trim that exactly the same as I did the first side. When your shoulder's quite narrow, it's this bit at the top that can get quite fiddly, but take your time and you can get into really tiny little shoulders if you do it a bit at a time. And that's the complete armhole. So obviously it is in need of a very, very good press, but you can see now how that looks. So I'm just going to do exactly the same on the other side to finish both my armholes. Now that both of my armholes are bagged out, the last bit I need to finish off around the top here is I just need to bag out the zip. And this is a lot easier than you might think. It is really simple. So I've got my dress inside out and I've got my lining here, and I need to put the right sides together around the zip. And it's lovely and easy. All you need to do is sew this the whole length of it. So your lining, you want to overlap the outer bit. Looking at it from this way around, what you want is about 1/2 centimetre of your lining sticking out beyond your main fabric like this. So it's nice and easy to demonstrate on the bit where I've got the two different colours, but 1/2 centimetre or 5mm of this lining poking out from there, and then you just need to obviously make sure everything's lined up. So I can line up my seam here, I can line up my top, and I just need to sew the whole length of the zip. And when you get to the bottom, you just need to go just above where the zip pull is. So if I just flip this around to the right side, you can see once that's finished off, it's going to be nice and neat. So back to the inside, I'm just going to pin this the whole length on both sides of my zip, and then I'm going to put a regular zip foot on just to sew fairly close there. You want it about 3/4 centimetre or 7.5mm from where you've stitched on, where you can see the stitch line where your zip teeth are. Just make sure you don't sew over that. So I'm going to get that sewn both sides, and I'm going to sew all the way up to the top. And now that that's done, you can see how neat it looks on the inside. It's great that I've got the contrast colour because you can really see what's going on. So that's all finished. The last bit is just to finish this little bit at the top here. So I need to just go back to the inside to show you how to do that. So you can do this by hand, but it's so easy to do on the machine that you're mad if you don't. So what I'm going to do, you can see there's a little bit of a ridge here, and that's because I've pulled my lining out here. I've got that 5mm sticking out. So if I go onto my lining side, when I fold this over like this, it sits really flat. There's no more little ridge. So you want to be folding, let's just show you again. So lining on the top, fold it over like that. It will naturally fall in exactly the right place. And all you need to do is where your stitching is here, just continue it to the end. So it's just 1.5 centimetres from the edge. And that's why I didn't trim that seam allowance at the time. And that is why when I did the understitching, I didn't go all the way to where I sewed that on, because I wouldn't be able to get back to that seam. So all I need to do is just stitch across there, and then I can trim the rest of my seam allowance off, and then that's that edge done. If you want any more detail on doing this, then all of that is all in my zip tutorial that I have given you the link for. That's all now finished off, so I just need a little hook and eye at the top. Obviously a very good press, like I keep saying. Need to pull all these little threads off, and I just need to finish the hem. So what hem you do really depends on what fabric you've used and how curved your hem is, all of those things. I'm just going to do a hand sewn hem on here. I've got a 3cm seam allowance, so I just need to turn that up. I'll give it a little press first and hand sew that, and I'm just going to do a double fold on my lining. I won't bore you by showing me sewing my hem. If you want any help with a hem, then I've got a separate tutorial link above and in the description of all sorts of hems that you can do on all sorts of fabrics. So I'm just going to get the hem done, I'm going to get the hook done, give it a press, and then we can have a look at this again on. So here it is again. You've obviously seen it at the beginning and you've seen it through the video, but I always like to show the finished product at the end. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you're excited now to go off and make your own shift dress, whether it be with the colour blocking exactly as I've done it or your own version. I would love to see photos of any dresses that anyone has made from this tutorial. You can always post them on my Facebook page. I would love to see them. So please comment below if you've got any questions at all, if there's anything you think I might have missed that or didn't make sense. And please like, subscribe, share my video. It all helps to grow my channel so I can keep making more and more tutorials.